lead a session on optimizing acoustics and signal flow for large-scale events. This session will highlight the importance of setting up convergent networks in live sound environments and explore immersive audio deployment in live performance settings. I will now hand the mic over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Be prepared for a geek session. I know the previous sessions were like panel discussions, very open. I'm going to try to make it not death by PowerPoint, right? As an audio engineer, we're supposed to use microphones. I mean, we're supposed to use microphones, mixing them. If I start this, just do like Shri just did now and point out, and I'll try to keep this microphone in front of me because it doesn't come easy, but I'll try. I'm going to talk about what I think is something that is upon us. It has been upon us for a while, which I call, or which the industry calls, convergent networks, right? But before I do that, a little bit about myself. So I'm Chris Lambrechts. I'm an audio application specialist for Avid in the live sound department. And what that job allows me to do is spend a lot of time in live sound environments and deploy workflows for bands. And one of the bands I do this for is Massive Attack. And I'll use that as a case study after I've gone through the boring bit, which is sort of the technology behind convergent networks, right? So what are convergent networks? It's all about optimizing audio control and communication in touring events. This is specifically for touring what I'm going to talk about. Convergent networks can be applied everywhere, right? They can be applied even in offices or in studios, definitely. Everywhere where sound and video is applicable and even light is applicable, you can see convergent networks, right? So what is a convergent network, right? Essentially, it is a combination of multiple services, voice, data, video. In my case, what I'm going to talk about is specifically about the voice or the audio part of it on a single network, right? I'm sure that if you're in live sound, you're faced by network protocols, right? Network protocols can be anything from the way a front of house or a monitor desk communicates with the stage I/O to having playback systems on Dante, maybe using AVB, AES-67 or Ravenna or other protocols, right? And what you still see a lot out in the world is that those network environments are each individually in their own ecosystem, right? What the world is moving towards, or what I think we should be moving towards, is this convergency or this combination of using all those multiple services on that single network, right? So basically that means a single infrastructure for audio, not only audio, and when I say for audio, it's actually the transport of the actual audio, but also the control part. Think of wireless mics, for example. I mean, right across the booth of Shure with their new ancient digital, they're getting console integration everywhere, right? That's an example of integration of network protocols in the control domain, right? Clocking, very often people forget about clocking. We're used to being in a digital environment now, right? I see some people who are old enough to have maybe witnessed that transition going from an analog-only world to a hybrid analog-digital world at some point, I think we were maybe too much in a digital-only world. We add network audio to that, which is just a flavor of digital audio as well, but we tend to forget about the clocking part in there. The industry is used of using word clock. The industry needs to still, in my opinion, learn everything about network clocking, which is a different concept, which I will come to, right? The support for multi-channel digital audio. I'm not talking about multi-track recording here, right? Think of an analog environment, maybe on stage, your mic cables. One cable transports a single signal, right? In a convergent network, multi-channel digital audio means not only that one protocol can do multiple channels, sometimes hundreds of them, right? But you can also combine all of them on a single copper or fiber connection, right? Even Wi-Fi, if you think about it, right? And another big part is that we want to centralize and simplify the network management. Going back to what I first was saying about being on a single network, if you're on multiple networks, and it still somewhat is the case even on a convergent network, right? You have a computer with Dante controller, maybe you have another computer which has a Milan manager on there, then there's another computer which has your wireless control for your frequencies. You want to even on a single network interface, right? That's what I mean when I say I want a simplified and centralized network management, right? Layer 2, 3 switches, right? A lot of times when I get these questions, people go like, oh, I can use any switch. You need a managed switch, but you also need a layer 2 and 3 capable switch, right? There's a couple of examples. Usually that means the more expensive switches. Don't go to your local media market and just buy a 50 euro off-the-shelf network switch. It won't do it. You need to be able to manage your VLANs and you need to manage everything that goes on that switch, right? So where do we come from, right? Traditional versus convergent, right? I'm going way back, maybe 30 years or so, or even more, right? Analog multicores, right? That was discrete control cabling. In an analog environment, a single wire, or a combination of wires in terms of an XLR, means that you do one channel or one thing on them, right? In analog multicores, I mean, some of you surely remember the big analog multicores that you had to bring over between front of house, and not only between front of house and monitors, but even on stage running multicores, right? We still see that a lot, but you also see more and more stage devices which just get thrown on stage and there's a network cable running there, right? So that's all about these convergent networks, right? In a converged environment, you get networked I/O rather than individual, even discrete cabling, right? That networked I/O also means that one single Cat5 cable can control all of the inputs and the outputs on that stage box, which are there, right? And you get virtual routing, right? And with virtual routing, I mean that it's not a patch, right? Go to studios in a studio environment where you have single points and you have to actually take a patch point, take a physical cable and hook that up somewhere else, which is what you tend to do in a traditional or in an analog environment, right? In a network environment, you get patch based. I'm sure you've all seen these patch matrices where you have your inputs and your outputs, your physical world and your virtual world, and you just connect them to each other, right? It obviously then reduces hardware, and it simplifies logistics. And when you start talking about simplified logistics, if you're on a big tour, your production managers who have to spend the money, their ear starts ringing, and they go like, ooh, that's interesting, we can save money here, right? And it's a modular system architecture as well, right? It's very easy to deploy, and I'll show you that in my case study with Massive Attack as well. We can have a setup where we have a one-off, and we don't need all the bells and whistles that we have on there for the tour that we're currently going to deploying. You just take out elements, and that's it. The basic setup stays exactly the same. You just don't use some elements of it. Right? So the benefits. Who's done like a 6 a.m. load-in to do setups, right? Do your line check, spend the entire afternoon trying to catch up on some sleep on your bus, do your headline show, and then do your load out until 3 or 4 in the morning, right? I mean, who doesn't dream of an hour of winning on either end, or even 2 hours or 3 hours, right? The massive attack system that we currently have takes us half an hour, including wiring, right, to do the package. I mean, we're 4 people, right, but it takes us half an hour, and then we have to wait for the truck, and it's usually the light guys, the lampies, that are not ready, right, but we're ready. So if the light guys can do the same, we would be able to pretty much be out of a festival with good stagehands within an hour rather than 2 or 3 hours, right? And that's valuable time, especially when you're on tour, which you get back in sleeping, actually, right? Redundant signal paths. People seem to think that redundancy is something like, oh, surely you do redundancy. In an analog world, you had 1 multi-core. There wasn't any redundancy. If you wanted redundancy, you had to have 2, right? So these days, redundancy is sort of expected to just be there. Network environments allow you to do that, you know, and then there's an whole other world where you can take redundancy to the next step. It depends on what kind of redundancy do you have. Redundancy only goes so far to your weakest point. But I'll talk about that in my case study as well, because there are some weak points, but those are sometimes limited to some of the gear not being ready to fully integrate with this yet, right? And then the scalability. I touched on it on the previous slide. It's very scalable, right? It doesn't have to massively grow in physical size to actually expand in network size, right? So this is probably the most technical one, but I still wanted to bring it up because I think it's important, right? And I'm only mentioning the audio protocols. There's loads and loads of more protocols out there, right? But these are sort of the audio protocols that are very common in use. I've added Ravenna. Ravenna is maybe less applicable in true live sound, but still, I think it's, especially in Europe, it's a very common, and you see it in broadcast, you see it more and more, actually, right? So I'll start off with AVB. AVB can come in different flavors, or AVB is now actually part of is a subnet of what TSN is, time-sensitive networking. It's a layer 2 protocol, doesn't require IP addresses. It relies on connectivity and discovery based on MAC addresses, right? Which is sort of the hardware level of the network where you go. Dante, AES, and Ravenna, they're all layer 3. They're based on IP discovery, right? They need IP addresses, whether that's fixed IP or DHCP, right? The sync protocol, I'll keep hammering on the importance of that clocking, right? And you know, the plot actually starts to thicken on this slide. Word clock is word clock, right? GPTP, PTP-v1, PTP-v2, whatever else they're going to invent in the future, they're all part of this network sync. And even in a network sync, you need someone to be the boss, right? You cannot just have everybody independently go off and expect you plug in a Cat5 cable and oh, it happily sits together and it syncs together. And there's a lot of pitfalls or booby traps to be discovered there. We'll talk about that as well. Latency. Once you go digital, latency is something to take into account. No matter you like it or not, once you go from an analog to a digital environment, and remember, a network environment is still a digital environment as well, right? You're facing latency. AVB is deterministic, meaning it's fixed. You cannot change it. There's no way to change that deterministic. It's usually 2 milliseconds or less, depending on the manufacturer. Where Dante and AES and Ravenna, they can be a little bit more flexible. It's not about good or bad. You can definitely get lower latency with the Dante environment than you can with an AVB environment, right? Where it does become a little bit more relevant, in my opinion, even more than how much latency you're facing, is with the QoS and the bandwidth. AVB currently is the only protocol that does guaranteed bandwidth reservation. All the others rely on the quality of service, right? So AVB guarantees that bandwidth reservation, where all the others, they rely on usually the switch to provide the quality of service. That quality of service is going to be higher for audio regardless, right? All other protocols on a switch. I mean, on a modern, good managed network switch, I've yet to run into an environment where this is actually an issue, even combining all of that, because even on a 1 gigabit network, there's a lot of channels of audio that you can send over it, right? Why the guaranteed bandwidth reservation is important is that it determines an exact arrival time. AVB knows when it's going to arrive. The QoS services will give you a guarantee that it does arrive, but it doesn't necessarily tell you when it's going to arrive. Now, the when it's going to arrive, you know, in a previous panel, for example, there was, at some point, someone brought up something about latency, right? And latency in the live sound environment being relevant and needed to be less than 3 milliseconds, right? Or maybe 5. That is very true in a monitor world environment. It is not so true for front of house, in my opinion, right? To some extent, I don't care if the sound takes 10 milliseconds or 15 milliseconds or 3 milliseconds more, because all that means is that from one day to the other, I might be, I don't know, 35 meters from my speakers, and then the next day, I'm just 40 meters from the speakers. So that latency, especially if you talk about milliseconds, I don't think it's that important, right? What I do need to know is that it guarantees that it arrives at the same time. And now I'm talking about a huge stadium arena PA system where you have a main hang and front fills and side hangs and delays and what have you. That's where you need that guaranteed arrival of time, because you cannot control the delays between those if you don't know when they arrive, right? With all the other protocols, that arrival time, it's a little bit more challenging, right? So what does that mean in the real world of live sound, right? I've dropped off Ravenna for this one because I don't think Ravenna necessarily for a live sound environment is that relevant. The others are, right? AES even to some extent is more broadcasty, but you see it in live sound as well. But especially between the two, AVB and Dante, right? Or all of them, they sort of sit still in their own ecosystem, right? AVB, there's native support for the two flavors of AVB, which is, in my world, I work for Avid, we use AVB, but we use a proprietary version of AVB, right? But we also use Milan, which is more sort of, that's the open one. That's sort of, well, I'm going to say maybe a little bit of a dangerous thing. It's sort of the equivalent of what Dante tries to do. It's not, let's face it. Dante is way more advanced in interoperability between different manufacturers. I mean, I've listed a bunch there. Avid Acoustics, Mayer Sound, DMB Audio Technique, Direct Out, RME, I mean, even console manufacturers, right? Yesterday I was speaking to a friend at Digico. They have a Milan card coming up. There's more and more flavors of AVB, but it's hardly comparable to the thousands and thousands and thousands, probably, from a consumer level to a high professional level. There's no consumer level AVB devices, not that I know of, right? So the adoption is much wider, but they each sit in their own ecosystem. Deployment, Dante, plug and play is a dangerous terminology to use as well, right? It's easier, right? AVB, not so much. And that's also why I think the live sound industry desperate needs knowledge of all of this, right? This deployment, it's still not a very easy to do. It's a very easy thing to do, right? It becomes easier, but on the AVB side, medium, I would almost say it's even hard, right? And definitely on the AES side, turn the monitors down, actually. Turn the monitors down. I don't need to hear myself. Definitely on the AES 67 side, it's quite complex to do the discovery because it literally is a manual discovery. At least the other ones are sort of an automatic discovery, right? I say sort of because there's theory and there's practice, right? Clocking. That's Pandora's box, right? I'm old enough, unfortunately maybe, to come from what was maybe sort of the end era of the fully analog world, but I still think I very much witnessed the transition from an analog world to a digital world, right? And at first, word clock was like, what's that all about? Just hook up two digital devices and surely they'll speak to each other. You add a third, you add a fourth, you become a little bit what maybe was a digital network. I mean, network is the wrong terminology, but you hook up digital devices to each other. And then very, very soon, when digital audio became more and more prevalent in our live sound industry, you get pops and clicks and you go like, what's that? And you needed to manage that. And it took, in my opinion, at least half a generation before the industry got used to setting up properly clocked digital environments. It did, because you have your rental companies, you have your audio engineers, you have your system techs, and we all need to learn about that stuff, right? But we've managed to do that. And I think for the last decade or so, whenever someone needed to use digital audio, whether that was AES or MADI or optical or whatever flavor you had, we knew that we had to look at the clocking and get that right. And we got good at that, right? So now we add network clocking, and I think it just basically starts all over again. We're in the same spot that we were when word clock started to become an issue, right? So there's differences. And I'll try to, in simple terms, explain what the main differences are, right? Word clock, obviously sample rate and bit depth are relevant, right? You cannot clock two devices that have a different sample rate, right? Basically, what word clock does, you have the boss, the master, and in a word clock environment, the beginning of each word, a pulse gets sent out, right? And that pulse just sits on that connection, right? And on the other end, the receiving end, or the slave device, he receives that pulse and he knows, like, that's the beginning of a word, that's the beginning of a word, that's the beginning of a word. And that's my point where I need to synchronize stuff. And as long as you do that, you don't get pops and clicks, theoretically, right? So basically, it's word-based. Word clock, it's based on the length of a word. Well, not the length of a word, but the beginning of that word, which is the pulse, right? And it is a point-to-point connection. There is distribution clocks, of course, but basically it's point-to-point connection or a daisy chain connection, right? When you go into a PTP environment, precision time protocol, and the essence here is the word time, right? It enables devices to sync to an exact point in time, and that's the main difference, right? Word clock, you have a word that gets sent out periodically, right? In a 48K environment, that's 48,000 times in a second. In a 96K environment, that's 96 times a second, right? What the grandmaster or the boss in a PTP environment does is he sends out messages, or pulses if you like. He sends out messages saying, this is the time. You know, I'm going to make a simple analogy. It is 4:25 or 4:26. And he says, it's 4:26. It's 4:26 and 1 second. It's 4:26 and 2 seconds. And the other end, the slave devices, they receive those messages and they go, oh, okay, I'll take that time and I'll adjust my own internal clock to that exact time, right? That time of synchronization is a matter of nanoseconds, right? And that is what PTP does. It determines a point in time, and everybody agrees on that point in time, or everybody who sits on that network agrees to that point in time and synchronizes, right? And it gets distributed over a network infrastructure, right? We'll look at that in the graphics that come up as well. So basic difference, word clock based on a sample or the beginning of a word, precision time based on time. And this is where the mess starts. We get analog signals from stage into a digital desk. We need to communicate to digital devices which rely on word clock, and now we expect to also include a network environment and expect things to go wrong. And that's where they tend to go, things to go right, sorry, and that's where they tend to go wrong. The other thing with PTP is, if you have a word clock problem, you'll notice it, especially on a big PA, right? The pops and clicks, they're not nice. You will hear them. If you have potentially a quote-unquote problem in a PTP environment or in a network environment, it can deteriorate your audio to a point where you don't even necessarily hear it. You can hear it. It usually, if it's really bad, it will start bit crushing, right? You get this bit crush sound and you go like, oh, that's out of sync, right? But it can degrade dynamics. It's sort of a high-end version of a 96K WAV file, and to convert it to a bad MP3, right? And you listen to them and you go like, this doesn't sound right. That's where the timing issue starts, right? So the case study. I literally come out of rehearsals setting the 2025 version up, and I'm actually flying back on Saturday, straight back to these rehearsals to continue this, right? So a couple of points of essence, right? We're about to go out next week. We're going out on what we call the Summer Festival Tour, right? What are the challenges? Front of house and monitors, they share inputs. We're on an Avid system. We use Avid SXLs, and we have this ecosystem of sharing inputs. Monitors obviously uses the outputs, but it's a system that works really nice, and so we're using that. But that system also uses AVB, so it's a network system, so that's our own proprietary protocol, which is AVB, right? And then we have a bunch of audio protocols which are in use. Obviously, there's analog audio, the mics and the lines that come from stage, right? They go into the local I/O, right? Stage I/O and PA backup feeds. Actually, usually the backup feeds are on stage, right? Or at front of house, actually. Then there's a bunch of digital AES going on, digital audio going on, which is, we use AES to feed the PA. We sometimes use Milan as well. If we run into an L-acoustic system and the local tech goes like, oh, we're on an AVB network, I can just go like, oh, do you want Milan then? And I can give them Milan, right? But we definitely use Milan for the tie lines, which is, in our world, some comms and effects. So Rob at front of house, all his effects go to the in-ears as well. So that's the tie line. See, the in-ears use the same effects that Rob is using in front of house, and they get the same reverbs, delays, and what have you, right? That's a Milan protocol, and we send that over Milan. PA feed and system management are also on Milan. And then we have Dante for immersive, right? This is an experiment. We're doing immersive audio on stereo PA. If you're interested, come and talk to me after this session, because it's a cool experiment that we're doing, right? And then there's a bunch of broadcast feeds. You know, you might end up at a local festival, and the broadcaster walks up and he goes like, do you have Dante by any chance? You can just go like, yeah, sure, where do you want it? Do you want it on stage? Grab it on that port. Do you want it here at front of house? I'll give you that port, right? And then there's network control. Paul, who's the monitor engineer, he uses the same switches. He has his wireless IEMs. He monitors what's going on with the battery levels on the belt packs. We use Venue Link. We do virtual sound checks. The virtual sound check protocols run over there as well. And the record and playback, not the playback for there was a question this year, like, shall we put the playback on there as well? We ended up not doing it because we don't have enough rehearsal time, but we could, actually, right? When I say playback, it's specifically for virtual sound check. And of course, system control, right? So that's what it looks like. Simple, right? I mean, come on. What's not easy about that? It is actually really easy. It looks very complex, and actually looking at that whilst I was making that drawing, I was like, wow, this is really complex. But when you start isolating things, you will see that it's actually really, really simple, right? Basically, there's 6 switches. We could have done with 4 switches at front of house, to be honest. The reason why we have 6 is because for smaller gigs, it's really easy to just drop the system rack and just do these 2. And you don't have to take switches out of anything. It's just a convenience thing, right? 6 switches, it's an A and a B switch, or a primary and a secondary, however you want to call it. It's redundancy. One set of switches goes on hot power, the other set of switches is on your UPSs, right? I'll start off with the MADI, because that's not only a network, that's not the network, that's the digital audio protocol, but it's relevant to the whole setup, because this is at front of house, by the way. What front of house does to go to essentially the DS100 in the end, the DS100 in the bottom is the immersive audio processor. We feed MADI streams out into a Prodigy MP, and the Prodigy MP is sort of the Swiss conversion knife. It's probably the most important unit in the entire setup, and you'll see that with the pictures that go along, right? We have console AVB. It's a network protocol that's not necessarily part, that's why I've left the switches out, it's not necessarily part of the convergent network that we're running, but it's a network protocol nonetheless, which is why I thought it was relevant to put on here. What the console AVB does at monitors and at front of house on that side is it communicates with the engines. The engines speak to each other, the consoles do not speak to each other. The consoles speak locally, and they each individually do, with the Pro Tools logo there and the Mac Mini that says Mac Mini Rob, those are the virtual sound check machines and the recording machines. That's all on your local network. Where we get into the convergent networks is on the stage AVB. We use a total of 264, 64, and then that's actually 32 inputs and 32 outputs, so that's 128 plus 32. I should have done this math before. I'm really bad at it. Someone help me. A lot. It's a lot of inputs. We don't actually all use them for convenience. Some of them are split up. But I think we have something like 90 inputs coming off of stage anyways. So those are analog mic pre's. All the outputs are there. And they're shared. Front of house is what we call the master. He controls the mic pre's. Monitors is a slave. It's what we call true gain, what we use on this store, right? So basically what the system does is you have your primary, which is the solid lines, and your redundant, which are the dotted lines. All your primary connections go to the A switch, and all the secondary connections go to the B switch. On managed networks, that's why you see these ports being green. These are VLANs that exclusively do the AVB flavor proprietary to Avid, right? I can expand those ports very easily as much as I like, but the green ports are exclusive for that. That's where you get into VLAN management, right? The engine connects there as well. The purple lines, what you see in the schematics, are trunk lines. Why do we use trunk lines? Because a trunk port or a trunk line typically sort of combines, it's tagged and untagged VLANs, right? It tags the VLANs, it sends them over your trunk port, and it is able to determine on the other side, it basically demuxes, if you like, all the information that it has from the switch setup. So it knows on the other side, through the fiber connection, hey, this signal is AVB, or actually it knows the flavor of the AVB because it's part of the same VLAN, and then you have your redundant connection, which Rob does on the front of house end, with that engine as well. So that's the communications schematics for the stage AVB, right? Management. It looks complex, but it isn't. Basically, you create a management VLAN, and anything that needs to be managed, you hook up to management ports, right? On monitors, we have a management port. You cannot really read this, but it says venue on stage, and you see iPads there? Those are actually monitor application apps. We don't give them to monitor engineers. It's actually, we don't give them to the musicians. It's actually the monitor engineer who has 3 iPads standing there for convenience. So he will flip between monitor mixes, but there's quite a lot of monitor mixes, and he uses 3 iPads as well to have quick access, especially for the mains, right? So there's 3D, one of the main vocals in the band. There's Daddy G, and then whoever is the vocal, those are on the iPads, right? That's managed through management protocols. The main control is on one of the Mac Minis in the system rack. I can, from the system rack, see everything that goes on. See all the protocols and control all the protocols and manage all those protocols, right? The Mac Minis each speak to the switches. And when I mentioned redundancy, for example, this is where potentially your redundancy falls apart. A Mac doesn't have redundant networks. You cannot have a redundant network on a Mac, unless you start adding NICs, but then you add another level of complexity, which you don't want to get into. So basically, all the units are connected on management ports, and again, are able to communicate through these purple lines, which are trunk lines, right? Next up is the Milan, right? We use Milan for tie lines, right? So tie lines, basically Rob sends effects returns. Paul sends some comms channels, so Rob can have access to those. The tie lines communicate between engine A and engine B. But Milan is also used through a Mac virtual entity, which allows me to use Milan as the audio device for things like Smart, right? I have my measurement mic plugged in to a mic input on the Prodigy. The Prodigy converts that to Milan, but Rob also sends me a reference from the console. He sends me a reference matrix over Milan, which I recover from that as well, right? So again, this is an example, I think, of how a lot of cables get simplified. I don't need a reference cable from Rob's console out. It's already there. I have that, everything sits on that one Cat5 cable, which is there, right? And I can do with that Milan, I can recover it wherever I want and use it for whatever I want. The Dante environment is actually specific for the system rack. Remember in the first slide, Rob is sending me objects for immersive mixing over MADI into the Prodigy. What the Prodigy then does, it converts it into Dante, right? And it sample converts it actually also. We're predominantly on a 96K system, it converts it into 48K. Prodigy through the Dante primary and secondary VLANs communicates to the DS100. The DS100 processes the object placements, sends it back through the switches to the Prodigy. Prodigy reconverts it into MADI, sends it back to the desk, and we have a version of an immersive mix on the desk as well, right? And then the clocking. The Prodigy, I mentioned earlier on, is the most important part. The Prodigy is word clock master. It's also the grandmaster. And the grandmaster meaning it controls the Milan GPTP flavor of PTP and the Dante PTP flavor of network clock. What the switches do, I use Luminex switches, what the switches do, they are boundary clocks. And boundary clocks means that they get that information over the audio, the various audio protocols. So they get Dante PTP on the Dante VLAN, they get Milan PTP on the Milan VLAN, and they distribute it across the network. So that same clock automatically, through the ISL links, gets distributed wherever I configure a Dante or a Milan port. It will have that PTP already there. That's what the boundary clocks do, right? And then, very often, maybe one last thing, the media clock, right? Because I word clock the engine from the word clock out on the Prodigy MP, it also serves as the media clock master for my AVB network. So this is how our system works. Internal sync, whichever system comes online last, is the media clock master. Unless I word clock one of the engines externally, that automatically then takes over the media clock. And media clock, for reference, is sort of the equivalent of what a word clock is. It's a word clock distribution over a digital network, but it's sort of the same, right? So everything media clock-wise is also coming from the Prodigy, right? I hope that makes sense. Because now I'll open it up for Q&A. Any questions on that? Yeah?
Check. You on a PPT, right? Can we go back to that AVB slide?
Now I could use the monitors back.
This mic, if you can put up.
Go back to the PTP slide.
Yeah.
The previous one. This one.
No, the AVB, where you showed all the Ravenna.
Okay.
And,
Yeah.
I have a very layman question, stupid one.
This one? This one?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So here in the latency thing, you said that this is deterministic, means 2 milliseconds means everything is going to be 2 milliseconds, right?
Yes, in our network, for example, the latency is always 2 milliseconds.
Right.
Right.
What happens with Dante? Because it's a variable, right? Between 0.25 to 5. So the more the number of channels, the more the latency creeps
Exactly.
in, right?
So Dante, I can't remember the numbers by heart, but I think at 96K, you can set it as low as, someone correct me, 32 samples is the lowest setting. You have a setting, right? Latency.
Right.
And that's exactly what happens. 32, the lowest setting, you can get away with a certain bandwidth. And what the Dante protocol, so basically we guarantee in AVB world that it doesn't matter whether it's, I think it's 512 streams at 96K. Doesn't matter whether you use one or whether you use 60 or whether you use 80. We guarantee that no matter how many channels or streams that you use, your audio will be okay. It will be clean audio. Where Dante more sort of takes the approach like, you know what, you want very low latency, that comes at a cost. That comes at a cost of channel count. If you want to use 100 channels, you're not going to get away with the lowest latency setting. So it's sometimes, it has pros and cons, right? There's advantages, there's disadvantages. The advantage for us is you don't need to worry about it in AVB land. The advantage in Dante is like, if you want that low latency, you can set it. So does that make sense? Does that answer?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Sorry, I'm going to drive you nuts. Can you go back to where you were explaining all the media clock and...
I'm sorry, I have a hard time understanding.
Okay.
Can I have the monitors back?
Can you put my mic on the monitor for him?
Yeah?
Hello? Yeah?
Okay, let's try again.
Yeah?
Yeah?
Can you go back to where you were showing the media clock?
Okay. On the graphics?
Yes.
Right? Okay. This one?
Yes.
Yeah?
So now everything is clocked, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through the PTP thing, right? This is not word clock, right? This is through the that purple thing. What do you call it? I forgot.
So we're talking about
the Prodigy, but
the Prodigy, right?
Yeah, but
so the Prodigy is
the
basically
trunk lines. Sorry, the trunk lines are doing the clocking, right? The purple lines.
No, the purple lines are the trunk ports. I've left those in place, and maybe this is confusion.
Yeah.
The purple lines make sure that basically my Prodigy for management is connected to this switch, right? But so is the Dante port. It's connected to this switch. What these lines do is make sure that that information goes across all the way to here on a single fiber cable. So all that information, no matter how many VLANs I use, because the blue one is the management VLAN, or groups, as they call them. Think of it as audio groups, right? And audio groups have members in them, right? So I have different groups with different members in them. I can use a single line of communication to get this information across and send it all the way over to here, where this system will also know, like, oh, there are X amount of members in the management group, there are X amount of members in the Milan group, and there are X amount of members in the Dante group. That's what the purple lines do. You call it an inter-switch link, or a trunk port is the more industry name, I guess.
And between Dante and Milan, how do you determine who's going to be the master?
So,
because actually this is
Dante
right?
Dante in its own environment has its own master, which is a PTP master.
Right.
In this case, in Dante controller, I just determine that the Prodigy MP, I click the external sync box, right? So Dante, or actually, the Prodigy MP is the master for the Dante environment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah?
Okay.
In the Milan environment, so the Prodigy has a Milan card. I guess you could call the equivalent of a Dante controller. There's Avid controllers, we call them in AVB. It's slightly more complicated. That's why Dante is way more user-friendly. But But the Milan card settings in the Prodigy allow me to tell it whether it needs to sync to the card itself, meaning it will sync on incoming stream, or I can set it to the Prodigy itself, which means it's going to run its own master clock, its own media clock, and I reference everything else of the Prodigy Milan card, actually. So the Milan is at that point the GPTP master.
Ah, okay. So you can do that. So you can reference the card, the Prodigy, the card in the to itself, and then tell other people to refer to
exactly
to do.
That.
Hey,
Yeah.
Okay. That
Yeah.
that I don't think is possible with other things, right? Once you shift clock, but that's clock.
But
This
that's
is
where-
PTP, right?
So in PTP land, you have different sorts of devices, right?
Right.
That's for example, and actually it's not that an uncommon question, because that's where the media clock master comes in, right? For example, our Milan card, we cannot join. We call them clock domains, right? And in Hive, for example, you can control clock domains. It's literally sort of a group on its own as well. And you can see, or you can actually say like, oh, I have these different Milan devices. I take all of them and I see the Prodigy Milan card and I go, right, you're the master and all of you here, all you lot, I drag you into that group as well and you listen, right? Our own Milan card cannot do that. Another way of doing that is using CRF, clock reference. CRF stands for clock reference format, clock reference format. So it is exactly the same format. So what I do in Hive, you have a CRF port as well. It's sort of like a word clock in-out, but in a virtual world. I can take the CRF clock from the Prodigy card and connect that, sort of like a patch bay, to the CRF in, if you like, or in the network, you have talkers and listeners. So the Milan card from the Prodigy, the talker side, I take that CRF stream and I connect it to the listening side of my Milan card in the AVB land, and I set that to the listener stream. And that way, that clocking is guaranteed as well, right?
And you're not clocking the soundscape thing too, or it's not getting any streams.
Soundscape sits on Dante, so in
on
Dante
Dante,
controller,
okay,
the DS100 is there, and in Dante controller, I determine that my clock master is the Prodigy, and the Prodigy is set to external sync, right? Because it clocks to its own internal clock, right? See, and this is exactly why I think that our industry is in desperate need of, one, simplifying all of this, and two, knowledge. I'm sure that the newer generation and the young people, they will play with this, just like we at some point played with digital audio, right? That's why convergent networks are so important, and because they're there and they're going to expand, right? Other questions? Cool. I thank you.
Can you
very
hot
much.
swap the
Oh, sorry.
Prodigy? Can you hot swap the Prodigy in case it fails?
It would have
Or
to
will
be
you
a
have to
redundant-
power down everything and then re-power up everything?
It would probably, Prodigy actually, and I'm going to make a little bit of advertisement for direct out here, right? Prodigy has a redundancy system on its own. It's called ears, right? The redundancy in the Prodigy at this point is redundant power supplies, right? But it's sort of the same as the front of house engine. It's redundant power supplies. I only have one Prodigy. I mean, Luca from Direct Out, he does these presentations on redundancy with Direct Out system for things like the Eurovision Song Festival. I don't know if that rings a bell. I think he uses something like 8, right? And everything is redundancy of redundancy of redundancy. And it is a saying that, so how far do you take redundancy? In many cases, it is literally as deep as your pockets go. You know, they're not cheap. So Eurovision Song Contest can afford 8 prodigies. We can't.
Hello.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for this detailed presentation. Really
Okay,
appreciate
thank
it.
Yeah.
I'm actually not from the audio world, but
Okay.
primarily from the software background.
Yeah.
But I have a question not related to live sound, but the recorded sound,
Okay.
and specific to the digital audio. Now, as you said, even like when I was born, it was primarily the audio world, and then after more than a decade, the digital audio came in. Now, when the new device which has come in is basically the digital to audio analog converter. Now, on my DAC device, primarily there are various digital inputs like the optical, there is coaxial, there's HDMI, and there's also USB. You talked about AES, and I saw that one input, and now I can relate it to the AES protocol, based on which it's very similar to an XLR input. That's what I've seen. Now, all these various types of digital inputs, do they are they based on various protocols, like or?
I think in the kind of formats that they would all rely on some kind of clocking. And
Clocking, okay.
that's where sometimes consumer devices, they lack, right? Because you cannot clock them. They don't worry about clock because it's maybe not relevant for them. I think HDMI certainly is. I actually don't know.
Okay.
Maybe HDMI, Shri, do you know? Does HDMI actually carry a clock in there as well? No?
Okay.
But optical does, and AES signals do. So you can, transport clocking information over most of the digital formats that you mentioned.
Okay.
But for example, it's not really relevant for if you have, I don't know, a preamplifier in a home consumer setup and you use an optical cable and clock that out. To some extent, it's not really relevant because it doesn't need to speak to anything else. Where word clock really becomes relevant is, I'm from the school where the theory of digital audio dictates that whoever sends audio is the master, and whoever receives the audio listens to the incoming one.
Okay.
So, but that theory then immediately gets broken if you talk about inputs and outputs. So I'm sending you digital audio, but you also need to send it back to me. So who is now the master, right? There's your first conflict. Add multiple devices to that, and you need dedicated word clock, or at least a master who determines in a single direction, like, I'm the boss, I'm sending out those pulses when these words begin, and you're all going to listen to this.
Is that the reason why there's also a device called as the DDC, which is digital to digital converter, which is primarily responsible for clocking? Any idea on that? No?
So which device is that?
Digital to digital converter, that's like a before you send the digital data to...
So is that to go between various digital formats? Because digital to digital converter, I'm sorry, I don't know.
I haven't read in detail, but what I found was basically that it is based on clocking, and primarily there was a challenge with the USB digital input. And it resolves a lot of those issues by having a separate digital to digital converter and then feeding it into a digital to analog converter.
I would have to see that device. I honestly don't know.
No problem. Thank you.
Like that. Yeah. No worries. Thank you, everyone, for spending the time and listening to me blabber on for an hour. Thank you.